He walked into the charity gala with his mistress on his arm, while his pregnant wife watched from across the ballroom. What he didn't know, her billionaire father was about to destroy everything he'd built. This is the true story of Victoria Bennett, a woman who gave up her career, her dreams, and her identity for a man who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone. But when Blake Hastings made the fatal mistake of underestimating his wife, he triggered a chain of events that would cost him his company, his freedom, and everything he valued. Before we begin, if you appreciate stories of courage and justice, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you'd do in Victoria's situation, and subscribe because the women who refuse to stay silent deserve to have their stories heard. Now, let's start at the beginning. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, painting everything in shades of gold. Victoria Hastings stood in the gleaming kitchen, her hands moving carefully as she arranged white roses in a crystal vase. 7 months pregnant, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone carrying something precious. Tonight was their anniversary, 5 years of marriage. She had planned everything perfectly: his favorite meal, the wine he loved, even the playlist of songs from their wedding. The table was already set with their good china, the candles waiting to be lit. Blake would be home by 7. He had promised. They would celebrate quietly. Just the two of them. Well, 3. Her hand drifted to her rounded belly, feeling the flutter of movement inside. She smiled, imagining their life once the baby arrived. A daughter. The ultrasound had revealed. They would name her Elizabeth, after Blake's grandmother. The nursery was almost finished: soft cream walls, a white crib, a rocking chair by the window where Victoria imagined holding her daughter, watching the city lights twinkle below. The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her thoughts. "Blake, you're home early." He strode in, barely glancing her way. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit crisp despite the long day. He tossed his briefcase onto the marble counter, already scrolling through his phone. "I need to pack. Flying to Boston in the morning. Client emergency." Victoria's smile faltered. "But tonight is—" "I know what tonight is. Tori." He sighed, the kind of sigh that said he was being patient with her. "This deal is worth $12 million. The anniversary dinner can wait. We already waited last year. And the year before that." Blake looked up then, his blue eyes cold. "I'm building something here. Hastings Media Group doesn't run itself. Someone has to make the sacrifices." The words stung because they were partially true. She had made sacrifices. She had left her own career in marketing 3 years ago when Blake said he needed her support full-time. She had postponed her MBA when he said the timing was bad. She had become the perfect corporate wife, attending events, hosting dinners, smiling for photographs. And now she was pregnant, and he could barely look at her. "I made your favorite dinner," she said quietly. "I'll grab something at the airport." He was already walking toward the bedroom. "Amber's handling the logistics. She'll meet me at the gate." Amber, his executive assistant, 24 years old, blonde, and efficient. Blake mentioned her constantly. Amber arranged this. Amber handled that. Amber understood the business in a way that Victoria used to. Victoria felt something twist in her chest. She told herself it was nothing. Blake worked hard. Amber was just good at her job. This was normal. But her hand trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone and opened their shared banking app. She told herself she was just checking their account, making sure the anniversary gift charge had gone through. The jewelry store receipt she had seen last week, surely that was her present. Instead, she found a charge from the Four Seasons Hotel, Boston, 2 nights. Last week, her heart began to pound. Blake had been in Boston last week. A 2-day trip. He had said, meetings, late nights. Amber had gone with him to take notes. 1 room or 2. The charge didn't say. Victoria's finger hovered over the transaction. Then she exited the app. She was being paranoid. Pregnancy hormones. That's what her doctor had said. Emotions run high. Anxiety is normal. But that night, after Blake had left in a rush of expensive cologne and barely there kisses, Victoria sat alone at the perfectly set table. The candles remained unlit. The roses began to droop. And she could not shake the feeling that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. She picked up her phone and called her best friend. Julia, I need your help. Julia Parker had been Victoria's roommate at Columbia, back when Victoria still had her own dreams. Now Julia was a divorce attorney at one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms. She had seen every kind of betrayal, every variety of lie. What's wrong? Julia's voice was instantly alert. I think Blake might be. Victoria couldn't finish the sentence. I need you to tell me I'm being crazy. Where are you? I'm home alone on our anniversary. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, what do you need? I need to know the truth. The next morning, Victoria stood in the marble bathroom, staring at her reflection. Her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her hazel eyes looked tired. The ivory silk nightgown draped over her pregnant belly. She looked like someone's wife, someone's mother. She did not look like someone whose husband would cheat, but appearances, she was learning, meant nothing. Her phone buzzed. Julia, I have someone who can help. Discreet, professional. He works for your father sometimes. Richard Bennett, Victoria's father, billionaire, philanthropist, the man who had built Bennett Capital from nothing and who had never particularly liked Blake. Don't tell my father, Victoria said quickly. Not yet. The investigator's name is Todd Brennan, former Secret Service. He'll reach out today. Victoria stared at her phone after Julia hung up. This was real. She was hiring someone to follow her husband. The thought made her sick, but not as sick as the alternative, remaining blind while Blake made a fool of her. Todd Brennan called at noon. His voice was calm, professional. Mrs. Hastings, Julia Parker gave me your information. I understand you need some questions answered. I think my husband is having an affair. And what makes you think that? She told him about the hotel charge, the constant mentions of Amber, the way Blake looked at his phone and smiled at messages he never let her see. I can have preliminary information in 48 hours, Todd said. But Mrs. Hastings, I have to ask, are you prepared for what I might find? Victoria looked down at her bitterly, at the daughter growing inside her, at the life she had built on what might be a foundation of lies. Yes, she whispered. I need to know. The next 2 days felt like years. Victoria moved through her routines like a ghost. She attended a charity luncheon and smiled at the right moments. She called her obstetrician and confirmed her next appointment. She folded tiny onesies and arranged them in dresser drawers. And she waited. On the third day, Todd called. Mrs. Hastings, can you meet me somewhere private? They met at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan's gossiping elite. Todd slid a manila envelope across the table. I'm sorry, he said. Victoria's hands shook as she opened it. Inside were photographs. Blake and Amber outside the Four Seasons. Blake's hand on her lower back. Amber laughing, looking up at him with adoration. Blake and Amber kissing in the doorway of her apartment building. Blake and Amber in a jewelry store. Him slipping a diamond bracelet onto her wrist. The bracelet, the charge she had seen. It had never been for Victoria. There's more, Todd said gently. Text messages. I was able to access his phone remotely when he connected to an unsecured network. No, Victoria closed the envelope. Her voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. I've seen enough. But she hadn't, not really, because seeing the evidence and accepting it were two different things. Part of her still wanted to believe there was an explanation. That part of her died when she got home and found Blake in the kitchen, pouring scotch. We need to talk, she said. He glanced up, annoyed. Can it wait? I have calls to make. Victoria threw the envelope onto the counter. Photographs spilled out, damning and clear. Blake stared at them. Then, slowly, he looked up at her, and he smiled. Not a guilty smile, not apologetic, amused. You hired someone to follow me. That's pathetic. Tori, Anna, you're having an affair and I'm pathetic. You're boring. He said it simply, as if commenting on the weather. You used to be interesting, ambitious. Now you're just this. He gestured at her pregnant belly. Needy, clingy, obsessed with baby names and nursery colors. Victoria felt something inside her crack. I gave up my career for you, bum. I never asked you to. That was your choice. You wanted to play the supportive wife, fine. But don't blame me when you wake up and realize you're useless. The words hit like physical blows. Victoria gripped the counter for support. So what? You're leaving me for her. Blake laughed. Amber understands ambition. She wants to build something. She's not content to just exist. I'm carrying your child. I know. He drained his scotch. Bad timing. Victoria's vision blurred. Bad timing. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, smiled. That's her now. We're going to the Bennett Foundation Gala tomorrow night. Your family's charity event. Fitting, don't you think? You can't be serious. Your father invited me. Technically, I'm on the board. You're just the wife. He headed for the door. Stay home if you can't handle it. I really don't care either way. The door slammed. Victoria stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by photographs of her husband's betrayal, her carefully planned life shattering around her. And for the first time since childhood, she called her father. Daddy. Her voice broke. I need help. Richard Bennett's office occupied the entire top floor of the Bennett Capitol building, 50 stories above Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city sprawling below like a kingdom. And Richard, silver-haired and steel-eyed, surveyed it with the calm authority of a man who had built empires. Victoria had not called him daddy in years, not since she was a little girl who believed her father could fix anything. Now she sat across from him, pregnant and humiliated, while he listened in silence to her story. His face revealed nothing the same expression he wore during board meetings, during hostile takeovers, during wars waged with lawyers and money. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then I never liked him. Victoria laughed, a broken sound. You gave us $5 million as a wedding gift. I gave my daughter $5 million. Blake Hastings got access to it because you chose him. Richard leaned forward. I knew he was ambitious trash, but you loved him, so I wrote the check. I made a mistake. Yes, you did. He said it without cruelty, just fact. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Victoria touched her belly. I don't know. He's the father of my child. He's a parasite who used you to build his company. Hastings Media Group would be nothing without Bennett Capital's initial investment and continued backing. He knows that, and now he's humiliating you publicly. Richard stood, moving to the windows. Tomorrow night, he's taking his mistress to your mother's foundation gala, to the charity named in her memory. The words hit Victoria like a slap. Her mother, Elizabeth Bennett, had died of cancer when Victoria was 16. The foundation funded cancer research and supported survivors. It was sacred, and Blake was going to parade his affair there. I won't let him ruin this, Richard said quietly. The question is, will you help me stop him? Victoria looked up. What do you mean? Blake thinks he's untouchable. He thinks my money and your name give him immunity. Richard's smile was cold. Let's prove him wrong. How? Go to the gala. Walk in with me. Let him see you're not hiding. I can't face them. Everyone will know. Everyone already knows. Victoria, society vultures have been gossiping for weeks. The only one who didn't know was you. He paused. Show them you're stronger than their whispers. Show Blake he didn't break you. Victoria's hands trembled. I don't feel strong. Then pretend, fake it until it becomes real. Richard returned to his desk, pulling out a business card. Julia Parker is good, but you need someone more aggressive. This is Margaret Foster. She specializes in high-profile divorces. She'll destroy him legally. I don't want revenge. This isn't revenge. It's justice. Richard's voice softened slightly. Your mother would want you to fight, not for him, for yourself, for your daughter. Victoria took the card. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. Strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up. Okay, Beautoyer, Victoria whispered. I'll go to the gala. Good. I'll have my driver pick you up at 6. Wear the navy dress your mother wore to the state dinner. The one in your closet. Victoria blinked. How did you know that was in my closet? Because I put it there 5 years ago, when you married him. Insurance, in case you ever needed a reminder of who you really are. Richard's expression was unreadable. You're not Miss Blake Hastings. You're Victoria Bennett. My daughter. Act like it. That evening, Victoria met with Margaret Foster in a conference room that smelled of leather and expensive coffee. Margaret was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Your father briefed me," Margaret said without preamble. "Your husband is having an affair with his assistant. He's publicly humiliating you. And you're 7 months pregnant." "Correct." "Yes." "Good. That gives us leverage." Margaret opened a leather portfolio. New York is an equitable distribution state. In theory, marital assets are split fairly, but fairly is subjective when one party commits adultery during his wife's high-risk pregnancy. I didn't know it was high risk. All pregnancies at your age, with your stress levels, are high risk in the eyes of the court. Trust me. Margaret smiled coldly. We'll also pursue emotional distress, breach of fiduciary duty since he used marital funds for his affair, and depending on what we find, potential fraud. Fraud, said, your father's investment in Hastings Media Group was predicated on Blake's marriage to you. If that marriage was fraudulent, if he was already involved with someone else when he proposed, then the investment contract could be void. Victoria's head spun. I just want this to be over. It will be, but first we need more ammunition. I want phone records, financial statements, employment contracts, anything that shows a pattern of behavior. I don't have access to his accounts anymore. He changed the passwords. Margaret pulled out her phone. Todd Brennan already forwarded me everything he found. But I want more. I want to know if Blake has other secrets offshore accounts, hidden assets, previous affairs. You think there were others? Men like Blake Hastings don't suddenly start cheating. They've always been cheating. They just get sloppier as they get more arrogant. The words settled over Victoria like a cold fog. How much of her marriage had been real? Any of it, Margaret must have seen something in her face because her tone softened slightly. "Mrs. Hastings." "Victoria, please." "Victoria, I know this is painful, but pain means you still care. That's human. What I need you to do now is channel that pain into clarity. Can you do that?" Victoria thought of Blake's smirk when she confronted him, the casual cruelty of his words, the way he dismissed her, their child, their entire life together. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." "Good. Then let's destroy him." The next evening, Victoria stood in front of her bedroom mirror, barely recognizing herself. The navy silk dress her mother had worn decades ago fit perfectly, despite her pregnancy. It was elegant, understated, the kind of dress that whispered wealth and breeding rather than screaming it. Julia arrived to help with hair and makeup. "You look beautiful." "I look pregnant and humiliated." "You look strong." "There's a difference." Julia fastened a simple diamond necklace around Victoria's neck. "Remember, you're not doing this for him. You're doing this for you." Richard's driver arrived precisely at 6. The black Mercedes glided through Manhattan traffic, delivering Victoria to her father's townhouse. Richard met her at the door, looking distinguished in a tailored tuxedo. "Ready?" he asked. "No." "Good. The best battles are fought when you're terrified. Fear makes you sharp." He offered his arm. "Let's go show Manhattan that the Bennett family doesn't break." The Plaza Hotel's ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers in Manhattan's elite. Women in designer gowns sipped champagne. Men in tuxedos discussed deals and politics. The air hummed with money and ambition. Victoria entered on her father's arm, her head held high, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Conversations paused. Eyes turned. Whispers started. And then she saw them. Blake and Amber stood near the stage, his hand possessively on her lower back. Amber wore a red dress that clung to every curve, her platinum blonde hair cascading in perfect waves. She looked young and vibrant, and everything Victoria didn't feel. Blake saw her at the same moment. His expression flickered surprise, then annoyance, then calculated indifference. A society columnist materialized beside Victoria. "Darling, how brave of you to come. Are you all right with this situation?" Before Victoria could respond, Richard's voice cut through the noise. "My daughter is more than all right. She's here to honor her mother's memory. Perhaps you should focus your column on the Foundation's achievements rather than tabloid speculation." The columnist paled and retreated. Blake approached the microphone on stage. The room quieted. He began his speech, the usual corporate nonsense about innovation and opportunity. But when he said, "I want to thank the incredible woman by my side," and gestured toward Amber, The gasps were audible. Victoria felt her chest tighten. Pain radiated through her abdomen, not sharp, but insistent. Stress contractions. Her doctor had warned her about this. Richard noticed immediately. "We're leaving." "No, now." But as they moved toward the exit, Victoria felt wetness between her legs. She looked down, confused. Then she understood. "Dad," her knees buckled. Richard caught her, his face transforming from cold billionaire to terrified father in an instant. "Someone call an ambulance," he shouted. The last thing Victoria saw before the pain overwhelmed her was Amber on stage, smiling in her red dress, completely unaware that she had just helped destroy more than a marriage. She had almost destroyed a life. The emergency room lights were too bright, too harsh. Victoria lay on a hospital bed, monitors beeping around her, leads attached to her chest and belly. The pain had subsided, but fear remained sharp and suffocating. Dr. Catherine Pierce, her obstetrician, stood beside the bed, studying the fetal monitor with an expression Victoria couldn't read. "Talk to me," Victoria whispered. "Is she okay?" Baby's heart rate dropped significantly. "We've stabilized her for now, but Victoria, your stress levels are dangerously high. Your blood pressure is elevated. If this continues, we're looking at potential preeclampsia, which could necessitate an emergency delivery." "But I'm only 30 weeks. "I know. That's why you need complete bed rest. No stress, no excitement." Julia burst into the room, her face pale. "I came as soon as Richard called. Where is that bastard?" "Blake," Victoria shook her head. "He doesn't know I'm here." Victoria pulled out her phone and typed, "I'm in the hospital. Baby's in distress." She watched the message deliver. Minutes passed, finally, 3 hours later. His response came, "Can't talk. In meetings. We'll call later." Julia snatched the phone, read the message. "I'm going to kill him." That night, while Victoria tried to rest, Richard met with Derek Moss and Todd in a private suite. "Blake's been embezzling," Derek revealed. "Money moved to offshore accounts. Payments to Amber, 50,000 over 6 months. Richard's smile was predatory. "So we can void my investment contract and demand repayment, $22 million. Do it." But the next morning brought new horrors. Headlines screamed, "Bennett heiress mental health crisis, history of instability revealed." Someone had leaked Victoria's sealed medical records, college anxiety treatment. Margaret called. "This is Blake's lawyer trying to establish you're unstable. It's desperation. We're filing for a restraining order and investigating the HIPAA violation." Then Blake's mother appeared on television. Victoria watched Sharon Winters calmly destroy her. "My son is devoted, but Victoria has always struggled with pressure. We tried to help, but she became increasingly unstable during pregnancy." "Are you saying Mrs. Hastings is mentally ill?" "She needs help." Blake wanted to protect her privacy, but she began making wild accusations. Victoria's hands shook. That afternoon, Margaret arrived with devastating news. "Blake filed for temporary custody, claiming you're unfit. He's citing mental health and wants to take the baby at birth." Victoria felt the world tilt. "They can't. They can try. We need our own psychiatric expert." The headlines shifted. "Custody battle Hastings seeks to protect unborn child." Victoria stopped reading. She lay in bed, hand on her belly, and talked to her daughter. "Your father is trying to take you before you're even born, but I won't let him." That night, Richard and Todd returned with new evidence. "Blake's affair with Amber isn't his first," Richard said. "There was an intern 2 years ago. He got her pregnant, paid for an abortion with company funds." Victoria felt sick. "And Amber, real name is Amy Sanders, changed it after being fired for embezzlement in Chicago." Margaret entered. "We hold this in reserve. If Blake pushes custody, we bury him. But we want him sloppy first." "Legal. I don't want destruction. I want my daughter." "Then trust me, after the baby's born, when you're strong, we end this." The weeks blurred appointments, filings, mounting scrutiny. Blake posted inspirational quotes on social media. The internet loved them. Victoria remained confined, the walls closing in, against Julia's protests. Victoria got up and found her old marketing portfolio. She'd once had her own identity beyond Blake's wife. When had she lost that person? She called Margaret. I want to make a statement. Blake will use anything. I don't care. I'm not hiding anymore. 2 days later, Claire Walsh interviewed Victoria in her bedroom. The interview was raw. Victoria talked about the slow erosion of her identity, about betrayal. Blake didn't want a partner. He wanted an audience. The moment I became pregnant, I stopped being useful. Blake claims false accusations. I have bank records, text messages, witnesses. If they're false, why can't he provide counter evidence? Because he can't. The interview aired during prime time. Social media erupted this time. The tide turned. Hashtag Believe Victoria trended. Blake's image cracked. The stock price plummeted. Blake called at 3 a.m. What the hell did you just do? I told the truth. You destroyed me, my company, my reputation. You destroyed yourself. I stopped covering for you. This isn't over. I will bury you. I'll take our daughter. And I'm recording this. The line went dead. The next day, Sharon appeared at Victoria's building. Victoria foolishly agreed to see her. You're destroying my son, Sharon said. Your son destroyed himself. Sharon's composure cracked. If you continue, you'll regret it. I have connections. You already did. You called me mentally ill on television. Then prepare for war. After she left, Victoria called Margaret. Sharon just threatened me. Record everything next time. This is escalating. Blake's desperate. That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. Elizabeth was active. Movements forceful. Something felt wrong. At 4 a.m., the pain started. Sharp, intense. Blood. Victoria called 911. At the hospital, Dr. Pierce met her in emergency. Your blood pressure is dangerously high. Baby's in distress. We need to deliver now. She's not due for another month. If we don't deliver, you could both die. They wheeled her to surgery. The last thought before darkness. Please let her be okay. When Victoria woke, she heard crying. A baby's. Julia sat beside the bed, holding a small bundle in pink. She's perfect. Victoria, your daughter is perfect. Victoria reached out. Julia placed the baby in her arms. Elizabeth, so small, but breathing steadily. Hi, baby girl, Victoria whispered. I'm your mom. Where's Blake? Julia's expression hardened. He hasn't called. Margaret's been trying to reach him, but he's not responding. Victoria looked at her daughter. Then he doesn't get to meet her, not until he proves he deserves to. For the first time in months, Victoria felt hope. Victoria was released from the hospital 3 days later with strict orders, bed rest, minimal stress, weekly monitoring. Dr. Pierce had been clear one more incident like the Gala, and they would be delivering early. Risks and all. But bed rest didn't mean surrender. Julia had converted Victoria's bedroom into a war room. Laptop on the nightstand, legal documents spread across the bed, phone constantly buzzing with updates from Margaret Foster and Todd Brennan. Comfortable, Julia asked, propping pillows behind Victoria's back. No, but functional. Victoria opened her laptop. What did Margaret find? Everything. Julia's grin was feral. She pulled up a folder on the screen. Blake's been embezzling for 2 years. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Cash withdrawals that don't match any business expenses. And Amber, she's not just his mistress. She's his accomplice. Victoria's eyes widened as she scrolled through bank statements, transfers to Amber's personal account, labeled as consulting fees, hotel charges, restaurant bills, jewelry purchases all funded with company money. This is fraud. This is a felony. Julia highlighted one transaction. See this $50,000 transferred to Amber 2 weeks after your wedding anniversary, the same day Blake bought her that diamond bracelet. Victoria felt sick. He used our money to buy her gifts. Technically, your father's money, which makes it even worse legally. Julia pulled up another document. Margaret's filing with the district attorney tomorrow. Blake's looking at criminal charges. He'll deny everything. Let him. We have phone records proving he and Amber discussed the payments. Text messages where she thanks him for taking care of her. Email chains about concealing the transactions from the company's auditors. Julia's expression was grim. Blake's not just a cheater. He's a criminal. And we're going to prove it. Victoria should have felt vindicated. Instead, she just felt tired. What about Amber? What happens to her? She'll probably flip on Blake to save herself, which is exactly what we want. Julia closed the laptop. Right now, though, you need to focus on staying healthy. Let us handle Blake. But Blake wasn't making that easy. That evening, Victoria's phone exploded with the notifications. Blake had posted on social media a carefully crafted statement that made Victoria want to throw her phone across the room. After much reflection, I must address recent rumors. My wife, Victoria, has been struggling with mental health challenges throughout her pregnancy. I've tried to support her privately, but when she began making false accusations and threatening legal action, I realized she needs professional help. I'm committed to being there for our daughter while also protecting Victoria's dignity during this difficult time. I ask for privacy and prayers as we navigate this family crisis. The post had 50,000 likes. The comments were a mix of support for Blake and vicious attacks on Victoria, though. Poor guy dealing with a crazy pregnant wife. She's clearly unstable. He should get full custody. Gold digger trying to take him down because he finally found real love. Victoria read until her vision blurred with tears. Blake had flipped the narrative completely. Now he was the concerned husband, and she was the unhinged wife making false accusations. Turn it off, Julia said, grabbing the phone. He's gaslighting you. Don't fall for it. Everyone believes him. Everyone believed him when he said he was faithful. 2. The truth comes out eventually. Julia sat on the edge of the bed. Margaret's releasing our statement tomorrow. We're not playing his game anymore. The next morning, Margaret Foster held a press conference that would change everything, standing on the steps of the Manhattan Family Court building, flanked by her legal team. Margaret addressed a crowd of reporters with the calm authority of someone who knew she held all the cards. My client, Victoria Bennett Hastings, has been the victim of systematic abuse, fraud, and public defamation by her husband, Blake Hastings. We have evidence bank records, text messages, and witness statements proving that Mr. Hastings has engaged in embezzlement, misappropriation of corporate funds, and fraudulent business practices. We are filing criminal complaints with the district attorney and civil suits for divorce and asset recovery. Reporters shouted questions. Margaret ignored them, continuing, Mr. Hastings has attempted to portray my client as mentally unstable. This is a common tactic among abusers seeking to discredit their victims. Victoria Bennett Hastings is a strong, intelligent woman who has been subjected to emotional and financial abuse. She will not be silenced. Margaret held up a folder. In my hand are documented proof of Mr. Hastings' crimes, offshore accounts, fraudulent transactions, evidence of an ongoing affair with an employee, funded by stolen company money. Mr. Hastings is not a concerned husband. He's a criminal. The press erupted, cameras flashed, and somewhere in Manhattan, Victoria knew. Blake was watching his carefully constructed image crumble. But Blake didn't go down quietly. That afternoon, his attorney, an expensive shark named Garrett Price, filed an emergency motion claiming Victoria was an unfit mother. The motion cited her history of mental illness, her erratic behavior, and her vindictive campaign to destroy her husband's reputation. The motion sought temporary custody of the unborn child upon delivery, with supervised visitation for Victoria pending psychiatric evaluation. Julia read the filing, her face going pale. They're trying to take your baby. Victoria felt the world tilt. They can't do that. They can try. And if they convince a judge you're unstable, Julia didn't finish the sentence. Victoria pressed both hands to her belly, feeling her daughter's kicks. No, no one is taking her from me. Then we need to prove you're not unstable, which means a psychiatric evaluation. Victoria closed her eyes. They want to put me on trial for having anxiety in college. We'll get your own expert, someone who can testify that stress and betrayal don't equal mental illness. Margaret's already on it. But the damage was done. The headlines shifted again. Custody battle brewing, Hastings seeks to protect unborn child. Is Victoria Bennett Hastings fit to be a mother? Friends close to Blake say he's fighting for his daughter's safety. Victoria stopped reading the news, stopped checking social media. She lay in bed, her hand on her belly, and talked to her daughter. Your father is trying to take you from me before you're even born, she whispered. But I won't let him. I promise. That night, Richard arrived with Todd Brennan and a briefcase full of new evidence. "We found something," Richard said without preamble. "Blake's affair with Amber isn't his first. There was another woman 2 years ago, an intern at Hastings Media Group, 22 years old." Victoria felt her stomach drop. He had an affair before Amber. He got her pregnant. Todd pulled out a document. Medical records show she had an abortion, paid for with a company check signed by Blake. He got someone pregnant and Victoria couldn't finish. The intern filed a complaint with HR. Blake buried it by paying her $50,000 in a settlement agreement that included a non-disclosure clause. Richard's voice was cold. "He's done this before. Amber isn't special. She's just the latest in a pattern." Julia leaned forward. "Can we contact the intern?" "Already did. She'll testify if we protect her identity." Todd handed over another file. "There's more. Amber Sinclair isn't who she says she is." "What do you mean?" "Her real name is Amy Sanders. She changed it legally 3 years ago after being fired from a financial firm in Chicago for embezzlement. Small scale, she stole credit card information from clients. The firm didn't press charges, but they did fire her." Victoria stared at the documents, her mind racing. Blake hired a woman with a criminal record. He probably didn't know or didn't care. Richard closed the briefcase. "Either way, it destroys his credibility. The man claiming you're unfit has been sleeping with a criminal." "We go public with this?" Julia asked. Margaret Foster entered the room, clearly having heard the last part. "Absolutely not. We use it strategically. If Blake pushes the custody fight, we bury him with Amber's past. But right now, we hold it in reserve." "Why?" Victoria demanded. "He's trying to take my baby." "Because the angrier he gets, the sloppier he becomes. And I want him sloppy." Margaret sat down. "Right now, Blake thinks he's winning. His public statement got sympathy. His custody motion makes him look like a protective father. Let him feel safe. Meanwhile, we're building a case that will destroy him so thoroughly he'll have nothing left. I don't want destruction. I want my daughter. Then trust me, we play this smart, and you get full custody, the majority of assets, and Blake gets a prison sentence. We rush it, and we risk losing everything." Victoria looked at her father. Richard nodded. "Margaret's right. This is war, and wars are won by strategy, not emotion. I'm pregnant and on bed rest. I don't have time for strategy. You have time. We deliver the final blow after the baby's born, when you're strong enough to face him in court." Richard's expression softened slightly. "Right now, your job is to stay healthy. Let us handle Blake." Victoria wanted to argue, but exhaustion pulled at her, and her daughter was kicking insistently, as if to remind her what actually mattered. "Okay," she whispered. "But the moment she's born, we end this." "The moment she's born," Margaret agreed. Blake Hastings becomes a memory. The weeks that followed were a blur of doctor's appointments, legal filings, and mounting media scrutiny. Victoria remained confined to her bedroom, the walls closing in a little more each day. Blake had not called, not once. He posted on social media regularly inspirational quotes, business events, carefully staged shots painting him as a devoted professional, navigating crisis with grace. Amber appeared in photos, always in the background, always smiling. The internet ate it up. "Hastings media stock is up 12%, Julia reported one afternoon. Blake gave an interview about focusing on work during difficult times. Investors loved it." Victoria stared at the ceiling. "So he's winning. In public opinion, temporarily. But Margaret filed divorce papers yesterday. Blake's been served. The divorce was swift and brutal. Victoria got 75% of marital assets, including Blake's shares in Hastings Media Group. Blake kept his company barely, but Richard now controlled the board. Blake also got a criminal trial date. The DA filed charges embezzlement, fraud, misuse of corporate funds. If convicted, 7 years in prison. That evening, against Julia's protests, Victoria got out of bed. She pulled out her old business portfolio presentation she'd created, campaigns she'd designed, proof that once she'd had her own identity beyond Blake's wife, when had she lost that person? The answer came immediately when Blake convinced her to step back temporarily. When he made her believe supporting him was the same as supporting herself, Victoria closed the portfolio. Then she called Margaret Foster. "I want to make a statement," Victoria said. "Absolutely not. Blake will use anything. I don't care. I'm not hiding. If I stay silent, the narrative is his. I want people to hear my side." Margaret was quiet. "What do you want to say?" "The truth." 2 days later, Victoria sat in her bedroom while a news crew set up equipment. Claire Walsh, a respected journalist, sat across from her. "Ready?" Claire asked. Victoria touched her belly, feeling Elizabeth kick. "Ready." The interview was raw and honest. Victoria talked about meeting Blake, about the slow erosion of her identity, about the betrayal. Blake didn't want a partner. He wanted an audience. Someone to applaud his success without demanding recognition for herself. "The moment I became pregnant, I stopped being useful. I became an obligation." Blake's attorney claims false accusations. "I have bank records, text messages, witnesses. If they're false, why can't he provide counter evidence?" Victoria paused. "Because he can't mean everything I've said is true." The interview aired during prime time. Social media erupted, but this time, the tide turned. Shad believed Victoria trended. Women shared their own stories. Blake's image cracked. The stock price plummeted. Blake called at 3 a.m. "What the hell did you just do?" "I told the truth. You destroyed me, my company, my reputation. You destroyed yourself. I stopped covering for you. This isn't over. I will bury you. I'll take our daughter." "And I'm recording this." The line went dead. Victoria forwarded the recording to Margaret, then turned off her phone. "Your father's scared," she whispered to Elizabeth. "Good." But fear made Blake reckless. The next day, Sharon Winters showed up at Victoria's building. Victoria, foolishly, agreed to see her. Sharon swept in, designer suit impeccable. "You're destroying my son. Your son destroyed himself. Blake made mistakes. All men do. But you've made this a public spectacle. He brought his mistress to a charity event in my mother's name. He made this public." Sharon's composure cracked. "If you continue, you'll regret it. I have connections. I can make your life very difficult. You already did. You called me mentally ill on television. If you just walked away quietly, with nothing, while Blake keeps everything built with my father's money." "Oh, I'm done being quiet." Sharon stood, smoothing her suit. "Then prepare for war." After she left, Victoria called Margaret. "Sharon just threatened me. Record everything next time. Don't let her in again. Any contact goes through lawyers." That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. Elizabeth was active, movements more forceful than usual. Something felt wrong. At 4 a.m., the pain started, sharp, intense, blood. Victoria grabbed her phone, called 911. At the hospital, Dr. Pierce met her in emergency. Face grave. "Victoria, your blood pressure is dangerously high. Baby's in distress. We need to deliver now. She's not due for another month. If we don't deliver, you could both die." They wheeled her to surgery. The last thought before darkness: "Please let her be okay." When Victoria woke, she heard crying. A baby's. Julia sat beside the bed, tears streaming, holding a small bundle in pink. "She's perfect. Victoria, your daughter is perfect." Victoria reached out. Julia placed the baby carefully in her arms. Elizabeth, so small, barely 5 pounds, but breathing steadily. "Hi, baby girl," Victoria whispered. "I'm your mom." "Where's Blake?" Victoria asked. Julia's expression hardened. "He hasn't called. Margaret's been trying to reach him, but he's not responding." Victoria looked at her daughter. "Then he doesn't get to meet her, not until he proves he deserves to." For the first time in months, Victoria felt something other than anger or fear or exhaustion. She felt hope. Victoria spent 5 days in the hospital recovering from the emergency cesarean. Elizabeth spent them in the NICU, her tiny body fighting to gain weight and regulate temperature. On the 6th day, they were finally released. Richard arranged for a nurse and security at Victoria's apartment. Blake had not called. His lawyer released a statement. "Mr. Hastings is relieved his daughter was born safely. He looks forward to establishing a relationship through proper legal channels. Cold, clinical. As if Elizabeth were a business acquisition, Margaret Foster arrived with her briefcase. We have our court date. 3 weeks. Judge Patricia Winters. 3 weeks. Elizabeth will barely be a month old. Blake's pushing for immediate hearing. He wants custody established before you can argue he's absent. Margaret sat down. Blake will claim you're unstable. Cite the emergency delivery. Push for supervised visitation while he has primary custody. Victoria's arms tightened around Elizabeth. Over my dead body. That's why we're strategic. I want Blake's employees who witnessed his behavior, the intern who had the abortion, and Amber on the stand. Will she flip? She doesn't have a choice. We've filed criminal complaints. Testify or face prison. Margaret's smile was cold. Loyalty only goes so far when your freedom's on the line. The next 2 weeks were a blur of depositions, legal prep, and new motherhood. Julia moved in to help. Richard visited daily. Todd coordinated security. 2 days before trial, Margaret called. Amber's ready to testify. The DA offered immunity for cooperation. The night before trial, Victoria's phone buzzed. Unknown number, drop the case or you'll regret it. Victoria forwarded it to Todd, who called immediately. That's Blake. Don't respond. I'm increasing security. The next morning, Victoria dressed in a navy suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back. She looked like someone with her life together. The courthouse swarmed with reporters. Inside, Margaret waited. Blake's already here. Ready. Victoria touched the locket around her neck, Elizabeth's photo. I'm ready. Blake sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, looking confident. When he saw Victoria, his expression flickered surprise, then calculation. Amber sat in the back, pale, avoiding Victoria's gaze. Judge Patricia Winters entered. All rise. Blake's attorney painted a picture of a devoted father denied access by a vindictive, unstable wife. He cited Victoria's anxiety history, the emergency delivery. Then Margaret stood. Your Honor, evidence will show Blake Hastings is not a devoted father. He's an abusive husband, fraudulent businessman, and danger to his daughter. Margaret displayed financial records. Mr. Hastings embezzled over $2 million to fund an affair. He got another employee pregnant 2 years ago, paid for her abortion with company funds. He has systematically lied and threatened, and he has not once visited or called his newborn daughter. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Derek Moss testified about offshore accounts, falsified records, bullying employees. The intern appeared via video, face obscured, describing Blake's advances, the pregnancy, the abortion he'd arranged and used as leverage. Amber's testimony was damning. She described how Blake pursued her, promised everything, convinced her Victoria was the problem, the money, the lisos, the manipulation. Did you know Mr. Hastings was married? Margaret asked. Yes, he said it was over, that Victoria only wanted his money. And did you believe him? Amber's voice broke. I wanted to. But I always knew he was lying. When Blake testified, he was smooth, confident. The affair was a mistake, embezzlement, and misunderstanding. Then Margaret cross-examined. Mr. Hastings, when did you last see your daughter? Blake hesitated. I haven't had the opportunity. She's 3 weeks old. When did you last speak to Victoria about Elizabeth's health? My lawyer advised. Yes or no? Have you called to check on your daughter? No. Have you sent gifts, cards, anything? No. You posted on social media twice the week she was born. Business achievements? You found time for that, but not to call your newborn. Blake's jaw tightened. I've been dealing with false accusations, consequences of your own actions. No further questions. Margaret's closing was powerful. The evidence is clear. Blake Hastings is unfit for custody. He's lied, stolen, manipulated. He's shown no interest except as means to control his ex-wife. I'm asking for Victoria to have full custody with supervised visitation, pending parenting classes and psychiatric evaluation. Judge Winters looked at both of them. I'll deliver my ruling tomorrow at 9 a.m. That night, Victoria held Elizabeth, trying not to think. Margaret texted, get some rest. We've got this. At 9 a.m., Victoria stood in court, Elizabeth in her arms, as Judge Winters delivered the verdict. Mr. Hastings, rarely have I seen such clear manipulation, fraud, and disregard. You embezzled money, conducted multiple affairs, abandoned your pregnant wife. This court finds you unfit for primary custody. Blake's face went white. Victoria Bennett Hastings is granted full legal and physical custody. Mr. Hastings will have supervised visitation, 2 hours weekly, contingent on parenting classes and psychological evaluation. Child support is $10,000 monthly, retroactive to birth. Furthermore, I'm referring this to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. The gavel fell. Victoria's knees buckled. Richard caught her. Julia was crying. Margaret smiled. Blake stood abruptly. He looked at Victoria. This isn't over. Yes, Victoria replied steadily. It is. Blake walked out. Amber slipped away. There is still the divorce, asset division, criminal investigation. Margaret said, but Victoria, you won the most important battle. Elizabeth is yours. Victoria looked down at her daughter. Can we go home now? You can go home. The media circus outside was overwhelming, but Richard's security created a corridor. Victoria walked through it, head high, Elizabeth against her chest. Someone yelled, "How does it feel to win?" Victoria didn't answer. This wasn't about winning. It was about survival. Judge Patricia Winters looked tired, as if she'd spent the night reading through every piece of evidence, every testimony, every lie that had been laid bare in her courtroom. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Blake. Mr. Hastings, I've practiced family law for 23 years. In that time, I've seen many difficult cases, but rarely have I seen such a clear pattern of manipulation, fraud, and disregard for the well-being of others. Her voice was measured, but each word landed like a gavel. You embezzled money from your company. You conducted multiple affairs with employees. You abandoned your pregnant wife and have shown no interest in your newborn daughter. This court finds you unfit for primary custody. Blake's face went white. Garrett Price started to stand, but the judge held up a hand. I'm not finished. Victoria Bennett Hastings is granted full legal and physical custody of Elizabeth Ann Hastings. Mr. Hastings will have supervised visitation, 2 hours per week, contingent on completion of parenting classes and a psychological evaluation. Child support is set at $10,000 per month, retroactive to the date of birth. Your Honor. Blake's voice cracked. Furthermore, given the evidence of financial crimes presented in this trial, I'm referring this case to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. Mr. Hastings, you should consult with your attorney about your exposure to criminal charges. Blake slumped in his chair. Garrett whispered urgently in his ear, but Blake didn't seem to hear him. Judge Winters turned to Victoria. Mrs. Hastings, I commend your strength throughout this ordeal. This court recognizes the challenges you've faced and the courage it took to stand up for yourself and your daughter. Full custody is granted. The gavel fell. Victoria felt her knees buckle. Richard caught her. Elizabeth secure in her arms. Julia was crying. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile Victoria had seen from her lawyer in weeks. Blake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He looked at Victoria, really looked at her, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. It was gone before she could identify it. This isn't over, he said quietly. Yes, Victoria replied, her voice steady. It is. Blake walked out of the courtroom, Garrett hurrying after him. Amber, who had been sitting in the back, slipped out a side door, avoiding everyone's eyes. Margaret gathered her files. There's still the divorce to finalize, asset division, the criminal investigation. But Victoria, you won the most important battle. Elizabeth is yours. Victoria looked down at her daughter, who was beginning to fuss. Can we go home now? You can go home. The media circus outside the courthouse was overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Richard's security team created a corridor. Victoria walked through it, head high, Elizabeth tucked against her chest. Someone yelled, "How does it feel to win?" Victoria didn't answer. This wasn't about winning. It was about survival. The divorce itself was swift and brutal. Margaret had filed for dissolution on grounds of adultery and fraud. Blake's attorney tried to negotiate, but Victoria was done negotiating. I want 75% of marital assets, Victoria told Margaret 2 weeks after the custody ruling. He built that company with my father's money and my support. He doesn't get to keep it. The prenup is void. He committed fraud. He used marital funds for his affair. The prenup doesn't cover criminal behavior. Margaret smiled. Now you're thinking like me. The settlement came through 6 weeks after the custody ruling. Victoria got 75% of all marital assets, including Blake's shares in Hastings Media Group. Blake got to keep his company barely, but Richard Bennett now controlled the board. Blake also got a criminal trial date. The district attorney had filed charges embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of corporate funds. If convicted, he faced up to 7 years in prison. Blake's supervised visitations with Elizabeth started 3 weeks after the custody trial. The first one lasted 20 minutes before he claimed he had a business emergency and left. The second one, he didn't show up at all. By the third missed visit, even the court-appointed supervisor looked disgusted. He's not interested in being a father. The supervisor, a kind woman named Rachel Montgomery, told Margaret, he's just going through the motions to avoid looking bad publicly. Document everything, Margaret instructed. We'll use it if he ever tries to challenge custody again. The day the divorce settlement finalized, Victoria stood in her apartment, Elizabeth asleep in her bassinet, and looked around. This place, this beautiful, expensive apartment, had been a prison. Now it was just a building. She called her father. I want to move. Where? I don't know yet. Somewhere with a yurt, somewhere Elizabeth can grow up away from all this. Richard was quiet for a moment. There's a house in Connecticut, 20 acres. Your mother loved it. I kept it after she died. Couldn't bring myself to sell. Victoria remembered that house summer visits as a child, her mother tending gardens, afternoon light through big windows. Is it still furnished? Everything's there, like she left it. I want to see it. 2 days later, Richard drove Victoria and Elizabeth to Connecticut. The house was exactly as Victoria remembered, white clapboard, green shutters, a wraparound porch. Inside, dust covers protected furniture. But underneath were the pieces her mother had chosen: soft sofas, antique rugs, family photographs on the walls. Victoria walked through each room, Elizabeth in her arms, imagining a life here. Quiet mornings, the sound of birds instead of traffic, room for her daughter to run and play. I'll take it, she said. Richard looked relieved. It's yours. Always has been. The move took 2 weeks to coordinate. Julia helped pack. Todd arranged security for the new house, and Richard hired staff: a housekeeper, a gardener, a nanny for when Victoria needed help. On Victoria's last night in the Manhattan apartment, she stood in the empty nursery and felt nothing. No nostalgia, no sadness. This place had never been home. It had been Blake's stage, and she'd been a prop. The Connecticut house was different. From the first morning, waking to birdsong instead of sirens, Victoria felt something shift inside her. She'd spent so long being Blake's wife, then Blake's victim. Now, finally, she was just herself. And Elizabeth thrived. At 3 months old, she was hitting every milestone, smiling, cooing, reaching for toys. She would never remember the chaos of her first weeks. She would only know this peaceful life, this quiet house, this mother who loved her fiercely. Blake's criminal trial started in October. Victoria didn't attend. She'd given her deposition, testified via video, and provided all necessary evidence. She didn't need to watch his downfall in person, but she watched the news coverage, unable to look away completely. The trial was a spectacle. Blake's defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. Former employees testified about his abuse. Amber, given immunity, detailed every illegal transaction. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Blake was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 3. He was also ordered to pay restitution to Hastings Media Group and fined heavily. When Victoria heard the verdict, she felt no joy, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of finality. Blake Hastings was going to prison, and she was free. That evening, Victoria sat on the porch with Elizabeth in her lap, watching the sunset paint the Connecticut sky in shades of amber and rose. Her phone buzzed a text from Julia. It's over. He's done. "How are you feeling?" Victoria typed her response. "Like I can finally breathe." And it was true. For the first time in years, Victoria felt like she could take a full breath without fear or anger or exhaustion weighing her down. She looked at Elizabeth, who was grabbing at the autumn leaves Victoria had collected. "Your father made terrible choices," Victoria whispered. "But you don't have to carry that. You get to be whoever you want to be." Elizabeth gurgled happily, completely oblivious to the storm she'd been born into and the peace that followed. Richard arrived for dinner, bringing groceries and stories about restructuring Hastings Media Group under new ethical leadership. Derek Moss had been promoted to CEO and was cleaning house, firing Blake's enablers and promoting people based on merit. "The company will survive," Richard said, pouring wine for himself and sparkling water for Victoria. "It might even thrive without Blake's ego driving every decision." "What about Amber?" "She took a plea deal, community service, probation, and she's banned from working in corporate finance. Last I heard, she moved back to Chicago." Richard paused. "Sharon Winters called me." Victoria tensed. "What did she want?" "To apologize. She said she was wrong to defend Blake, wrong to attack you. She asked if she could meet Elizabeth." "What did you say?" "That it's not my decision, it's yours." Victoria thought about Sharon's cold words in her bedroom, the television appearance, the threats. But she also thought about Elizabeth, who might someday want to know her paternal grandmother. "Not yet," Victoria said finally. "Maybe someday, but not yet." "Fair enough." Richard raised his glass. "To new beginnings." Victoria clinked her water glass against his wine. "To surviving." 2 years passed like pages turning in a favorite book. Elizabeth turned 4 years old, starting preschool with fierce independence. Victoria's foundation expanded to 3 locations across New England, helping hundreds of women rebuild their lives. And Blake Hastings became what he'd always feared forgotten. It was October when Victoria received a call from an unknown number. "Mrs. Bennett, this is Dr. William Hayes from Greenhaven Correctional. I'm calling about Blake Hastings. He's been diagnosed with early-stage pancreatic cancer. Poor prognosis. He's asked to see you and your daughter." Victoria sank into a chair. "Blake's only 42. Cancer doesn't discriminate. He's listed you as emergency contact," his mother declined. Sharon declined. She said, quote, "I've enabled him enough. He needs to face this alone." Victoria's first instinct was no, but she thought of Elizabeth, who would someday ask questions. "I'll visit. Once. Alone." 3 days later, Victoria drove to the prison. Blake lay in a hospital bed, connected to IV lines. He'd lost significant weight, skin sallow, eyes sunken. "Victoria," his voice was weak. "You came. Dr. Hayes said you were dying." "Yeah," he gestured to a chair. "Sit, please." Victoria sat, maintaining distance. "What do you want to say?" "To tell you the truth before it's too late." He coughed. "I've had time to think about who I was, what I did. You apologized 2 years ago. That didn't go well. Because I was still lying." Tears filled his eyes. "Now I'm dying, and I realize I wasted my life trying to prove I was worth something, and I proved the opposite. That doesn't excuse what you did. I know, I'm asking you to tell Elizabeth something. Someday," his voice cracked, "that I was broken, that it wasn't her fault, that she deserves better, and that her mother is the strongest person I've ever known." Victoria felt unexpected tears. "Why now?" "Because I'm finally scared enough to be honest." Blake reached for a folder. "These are letters. One for Elizabeth, when she's 18, and one for you." Victoria took them. "What about your mother?" "Sharon wrote me 3 months ago, said she was done enabling my self-pity, that I needed to take responsibility." Blake smiled bitterly. She was right. They sat in silence. Then Victoria asked, "Are you scared? Terrified? Not of dying, of being forgotten, of having lived for nothing?" Blake looked at her. Did I matter at all? She thought about the early years, before betrayal. Parts of it were real, before fear turned you cruel. But that doesn't erase what you did. "Yeah." Blake closed his eyes. "I'm sorry, for real this time." Victoria stood. "I hope you find peace. Will you bring Elizabeth?" "No, she's 4. She doesn't need to remember you like this. When she's older, if she wants to know who you were, I'll tell her the truth, all of it. But I won't manipulate her emotions with a dying man. Blake nodded slowly. You're right. You always were better at protecting her. Goodbye, Blake. Goodbye. Thank you for coming. Victoria left with the letters, feeling strangely hollow. When she arrived home, Elizabeth ran to greet her, covered in paint. Mama, look what I made. Victoria scooped her up. It's beautiful, baby. That evening, after Elizabeth was asleep, Victoria opened Blake's letter. Victoria, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. You were never the problem. You were perfect as you were, too, and I was too broken to see it. Elizabeth is lucky to have you. You're teaching her everything I never learned. I wasted my life chasing success when what I needed was to learn how to be loved. You tried. I'm sorry I couldn't accept it. Thank you for fighting, for showing Elizabeth what real courage looks like. I'm sorry. For everything. Victoria folded the letter and placed it in her desk. She felt sad for who Blake could have been, grateful she'd escaped. The next morning, she called Margaret. Blake's dying. His attorney will probably push for a compassionate release. Will you fight it? No, if they want to release him to hospice, I won't object. But he stays away from us. The restraining order holds. Blake was released 2 weeks later to upstate hospice. Victoria heard through Margaret, then stopped following. His death wasn't her burden. She focused on life, Elizabeth's Halloween parade, foundation fundraisers, Sunday dinners with Richard, calls with Julia. In late November, Dr. Hayes called. Mrs. Bennett, Blake Hastings passed away last night. Peacefully. Victoria stood in her kitchen, processing. Blake was dead. Thank you for calling. He asked that I send you a video for Elizabeth. Yes, send it. I'll decide when she's old enough. That evening, Victoria watched Blake's video. He sat in hospice, frail but composed. Hi, Elizabeth. You don't know me, but I'm your dad. By the time you watch this, I'll be gone. You are loved by people who chose to show up every day. That's real family. You're not responsible for my mistakes. Your mother is a hero. She protected you. Listen to her. I'm sorry I won't see you grow up. Be brave. Be honest. Be yourself. Goodbye, baby girl. I love you. Victoria sat in darkness, tears streaming, not for Blake exactly, but for the waste of it all. But she also felt closure. Blake was gone. His ghost could no longer haunt her. Elizabeth would grow up knowing the truth but not carrying his shame. They were finally completely free. 5 years later, on a bright October morning, Victoria stood in the ballroom of a Manhattan hotel, accepting a humanitarian award for the Sinclair Foundation's work. Elizabeth, now 9 years old, sat in the front row beside Richard, beaming with pride. Victoria looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces, including dozens of women the foundation had helped. Women who'd left abusive relationships, rebuilt their careers, reclaimed their lives. When I started this foundation, Victoria said, I thought it was about helping others. And it is, but it's also been about healing myself, about transforming the worst experience of my life into something that matters. My ex-husband tried to destroy me. He failed, not because I was stronger than him, but because I refused to let his definition of me become my reality. And every woman we've helped through this foundation has done the same thing, rejected the lies, reclaimed the truth, rebuilt from ashes. That's what survivors do. We don't just survive, we transform. We take our pain and turn it into purpose. We take our scars and turn them into strength. So this award isn't just for me. It's for every woman who's ever been told she's too much or not enough. For every woman who's been gaslit, manipulated, or abused. For every woman who decided she deserved better and fought like hell to get it. We are stronger than what tried to break us. And we will never be silent again. The applause was deafening. After the ceremony, Elizabeth ran up and hugged Victoria's waist. Mom, you were amazing. Victoria knelt down, cupping her daughter's face. You know what makes me most proud? That you're growing up knowing your voice matters. That you don't have to make yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable. Did my dad make you feel small? It was the first time Elizabeth had asked directly. Victoria had known this conversation was coming, had prepared for it, but it still made her heart ache. Yes, baby, he did. But not because of anything wrong with me. He was scared and broken. And he tried to make me feel that way too. But you didn't let him. Not forever. For a while, I did. But then I remembered who I was, and I fought back. Elizabeth thought about this. When I'm older, can I watch the video he made? Victoria had told Elizabeth about the video on her 8th birthday. When she'd asked more pointed questions about Blake, when you're ready, whenever that is. Okay, Elizabeth hugged her again. I'm glad you fought back, because then I get to have you as my real, actual mom, not the sad version of you. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Me too, baby. Me too. That evening, Victoria stood on the terrace of her Connecticut home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Richard joined her, handing her a glass of wine. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly. I think about her every day. What she'd say, what she'd do. She'd say you became exactly who you were meant to be. Richard paused. Blake's attorney contacted me last week. There's a small trust Blake set up for Elizabeth before he died. Not much, but something. I don't want his money. It's not for you. It's for her education. He was specific. It can only be used for college. Richard looked at her. Let it be his one good act. You don't have to tell her about it now. But someday when she's applying to schools, it'll be there. Victoria nodded. Okay, one good act. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere in the house, Elizabeth was building something with blocks, her voice carrying through the open windows as she narrated her own imaginary story. Do you ever wonder what your life would look like if you'd never met Blake? Richard asked. Victoria considered the question. Sometimes. But then I look at Elizabeth and realize I wouldn't trade her for anything, even if it meant avoiding all that pain. That's very evolved of you. Or very mother of me. Victoria smiled. Pain doesn't define us. Dad, what we do with it does. Blake let his pain turn him into someone cruel. I chose to let mine turn me into someone who helps others. And that, Richard said, raising his glass, is why you won. They clinked glasses as stars began to appear overhead, tiny points of light pushing back against the darkness. Inside, Elizabeth called out, Mom, come see what I built. Victoria laughed, set down her wine, and headed inside, toward her daughter's voice, toward the life she'd fought so hard to build, toward a future that was finally, completely her own. Blake Hastings had tried to end her story. Instead, he'd given her a reason to write a better one. Sharon Winters arrived at the Connecticut house on a crisp Saturday morning, 2 months after Victoria's award ceremony. She looked older than Victoria remembered, less polished, more uncertain. She carried a wrapped gift and a bouquet of autumn flowers. Victoria met her at the door, Elizabeth on her hip. Sharon. Victoria, thank you for allowing this. Sharon's voice was quiet, almost humble. I know I don't deserve— No, you don't. But Elizabeth deserves a chance to know her grandmother. If you're capable of being one. Victoria stepped back. Come in. They sat in the living room, afternoon light streaming through windows that overlooked the garden. Elizabeth, initially shy, warmed up when Sharon pulled out a stuffed elephant from the gift bag. She's beautiful, Sharon whispered, watching Elizabeth toddle around with her new toy. She has Blake's. She has herself. Victoria interrupted firmly. She's not Blake. She's Elizabeth. Of course, I just meant— Sharon stopped, gathering herself. I owe you an apology. A real one. What I did, going on television, lying about you, it was cruel. I was trying to protect my son, but I was wrong. Blake made his choices. You didn't deserve what I did to you. Victoria studied Sharon carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. But all she saw was an older woman who had lost her son to his own actions and was trying to salvage a relationship with her granddaughter. Why should I believe you've changed? You shouldn't, not based on words. Sharon set down her teacup. I've spent the past year in therapy, working through my own issues enabling Blake, prioritizing reputation over truth. I've made donations to your foundation. I've volunteered with organizations that help domestic violence survivors. I'm trying to be better. For Elizabeth, or for yourself. Both. Sharon's eyes filled with tears. I failed as Blake's mother. I let him become the man he became. I can't fix that, but maybe I can be the grandmother Elizabeth deserves. Victoria felt something in her chest soften slightly. Not forgiveness that would take time, but maybe the beginning of possibility. If you want to be in her life, there are rules, Victoria said. No talking about Blake unless she asks. No undermining my parenting. No society gossip or judgment. And if you ever threaten or manipulate me again, you're done. So, permanently. I understand. I mean it. Sharon, this is your one chance. Sharon looked at Elizabeth, who had brought the stuffed elephant to show Victoria. I won't waste it. The visit lasted an hour. When Sharon left, Victoria felt exhausted but not regretful. Time would tell if Sharon meant what she said. That evening, Julia called. I heard Sharon visited. How did it go? Better than expected. She seems genuine. You're more forgiving than I would be. I'm not forgiving. I'm cautious. But Elizabeth deserves to have family. If they can be healthy for her. Victoria paused. Speaking of family, how's the foundation coming? Growing faster than we can keep up with. We've helped 60 women leave abusive situations this year, provided legal aid to 90 more. The shelter in Manhattan is at capacity. We might need to open a second location. Pride swelled in Victoria's chest. My mother would have loved this. She would have loved you, Julia corrected gently. After hanging up, Victoria walked through her house, checking locks, turning off lights. This nightly routine had become meditation, a way of claiming her space, her safety, her peace. She paused in Elizabeth's nursery, watching her daughter sleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the way her tiny hand curled around her elephant, the absolute trust in her peaceful face. This was why Victoria had fought so hard. Not for revenge, not for money, not even for justice, though those things mattered. She'd fought for this: a quiet house, a safe life, a daughter who would grow up knowing her mother chose courage over comfort. Victoria's phone buzzed. A text from Richard. Board meeting tomorrow for Hastings Media Group. Want to attend? Victoria smiled. After Blake's conviction, Richard had restructured the company completely. He'd offered Victoria a position on the board, part ownership, part oversight. She'd accepted, not because she wanted power over Blake's legacy, but because she wanted to ensure the company treated its employees ethically. I'll be there, she texted back. The next morning, Victoria drove into Manhattan for the first time in months. The city felt different, louder, more chaotic. She didn't miss it. The Hastings Media Group offices had been renovated. Blake's aggressive corporate aesthetic, all black and chrome and ego, had been replaced with warmer tones, natural light, and collaborative spaces. The company logo remained, but everything else had changed. Derek Moss greeted her in the lobby. Victoria, good to see you. How's everything running? Better. Employee satisfaction is up 40%. We've implemented transparent salary structures, flexible work arrangements, and a zero-tolerance policy for harassment. Profits are up 2 turns out. People work better when they're not terrified. During the board meeting, Derek presented quarterly results. The company was thriving under ethical leadership. Several employees had even returned after quitting during Blake's tenure. We've rebuilt trust, Derek concluded. That was the biggest challenge. But I think we're proving that you can be successful and decent. Richard nodded approvingly. Any challenges ahead? We're facing some negative press from Blake's supporters, people who think the company should have stood by him. But overall, the narrative is shifting. We're becoming known as the company that did the right thing. After the meeting, Victoria stood in front of what used to be Blake's office. It was now a conference room. The walls glass, the space open and democratic. No throne, no kingdom. Feels different, doesn't it? Derek said, joining her. It feels honest. Later that afternoon, Victoria attended a fundraising gala for the Sinclair Foundation. She wore a simple cream dress, her auburn hair loose, no jewelry except her mother's watch. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. Richard gave the opening speech, but when it was Victoria's turn, she spoke from the heart. A year and a half ago, I was a different person. She began. I was trapped in a marriage that destroyed my sense of self. I believed love meant sacrifice, that supporting someone else meant erasing yourself. I was wrong. She looked around the room at faces young and old, men and women, people who'd never experienced abuse, and people who knew it intimately. The Sinclair Foundation exists because no one should have to choose between safety and survival. Because leaving an abusive situation takes more than courage, it takes resources, support, and people who believe you. Victoria's voice strengthened. This year, we've helped over 100 women start new lives. Next year, we'll help more, because every person deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, several women approached Victoria privately, sharing their own stories. A CEO who'd left an abusive marriage 5 years ago, a college student whose ex-boyfriend had stalked her, a grandmother who'd spent 40 years in a controlling relationship before finally escaping at age 60. "Thank you," they said, over and over. "Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for making it okay to leave. Thank you for showing us we're not alone." Victoria hugged each of them, crying with strangers who understood in ways her old society friends never had. This was purpose. This was healing. This was what came after survival. Late that night, Victoria returned home to find Elizabeth asleep and Julia reading on the couch. "How was the gala?" Julia asked. "Perfect, exhausting, important." Victoria kicked off her heels. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Good, because you've got a request that came through Foundation channels." Julia handed over a tablet. "Woman in Boston, similar situation to yours wealthy husband. Public humiliation, fighting for custody. Her lawyer reached out asking if you'd consider speaking with her." Victoria read the briefcase summary. The parallels were striking: the gaslighting, the financial abuse, the social isolation. "Set up a call," Victoria said immediately, "and get Margaret's contact information for her attorney. No one should have to figure this out alone." As Victoria prepared for bed, she checked on Elizabeth one last time. Her daughter slept peacefully, unaware that her mother was becoming someone who helped other mothers find their strength. Blake had tried to break Victoria. Instead, he'd forged her into something stronger than she'd ever been. That story of survival, transformation, and the quiet courage of beginning again would be Victoria's greatest legacy. Not the foundation, not the award, not the money or the victory, but the simple fact that she'd refused to disappear. She'd refused to be silent. She'd refused to let anyone else define her worth. And in doing so, she taught her daughter the most important lesson of all: you are never too broken to begin again. Victoria stood in her doorway, watching Elizabeth sleep, the moonlight casting silver across her peaceful face. Outside, the Connecticut night was quiet except for crickets and the distant sound of wind through trees. Blake Hastings had tried to destroy her. Instead, he'd given her a reason to become indestructible. And as Victoria finally climbed into her own bed, exhausted but content, she realized something profound. The best revenge wasn't destruction or even justice. It was building a life so full of purpose and peace that the person who tried to break you became irrelevant. Blake was gone. His legacy was a cautionary tale. But Victoria's legacy was just beginning, and it would echo far beyond anything he'd ever built, not in steel and glass and stock prices, but in the lives of women who learned they could survive, could fight back, could begin again. Women like her. Women she'd never meet. Women who would hear her story and find their own strength. That was power. That was victory. That was freedom. It was